Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to each of the witnesses for being here. Secretary Buchanan, as Wyoming Secretary of State, you oversee state election procedures. The bill that this committee is considering right now would, among other things, mandate ballot harvesting in Indian country. It would grant tribes full authority to reject and remove poll watchers not affiliated with the state, and it would allow tribes to request absentee ballots even when voters haven't requested them. In your judgment, would these provisions increase or decrease confidence in the integrity of Wyoming state and federal elections?
And thank you for the question, Senator Cruz. In my estimation, each of the things you mentioned in the legislation would decrease the confidence people have in their elections. There are really no safeguards that you can place on ballot drop boxes, especially in remote locations, that can prevent those ballots from being lost or stolen. I've often stated, it actually can go against the accessibility argument, because you could have someone destroy a ballot box or drop box, and it would almost be impossible to know whose ballot was lost. How would you notify those people that their ballot was destroyed? You'd have really no way of doing that, because the ballots would be destroyed. The other things you mentioned are similar to that. You cannot have an election that people don't believe in, because if they don't believe that the result has integrity, you will drive down election participation. And that goes against the entire premise, really, and goal, I think, that we collectively share.
Thank you, Secretary Buchanan. One of the unfortunate things listening to this hearing, we live in a time where the country is very polarized and it is divided politically. And often it seems that Democrats talk to the left, Republicans talk to the right. We don't talk to each other. We don't have conversations. We don't. Liberals listen to left-leaning news. Conservatives listen to right-leaning news. And the discussion here sadly reflects this. So we heard testimony from two witnesses, Secretary Buchanan and Ms. Frankenstein, about the risks of voter fraud from ballot harvesting. We heard testimony about the risks of voter fraud from drop boxes. We heard testimony about the risks of voter fraud from sending ballots to voters who didn't request them, sending them to public buildings with no security provisions whatsoever. And what is striking to me is that none of the witnesses invited by the Democratic majority addressed those issues in any way, shape, or form. None of the Democratic senators who spoke addressed those issues in any way, shape, or form. It's not like they're engaging in saying, well, yes, ballot harvesting, there have been problems, but. No, they don't engage in it at all. They simply ignore it. I'm looking, for example, in the state of Texas. In November, the Texas Attorney General brought an indictment against one Texan for 134 felony counts for ballot harvesting. And this is a woman who worked in the Mejia State Supported Living Center, who submitted voter registration applications, for 67 residents without their signature, without their effective consent. A number of those residents had been adjudicated by a court as mentally incapacitated. And so you have an instance where a political operative is seeking to vote for people who are legally ineligible to vote and who lack the capacity to make those determinations. That's why so many states prohibit ballot harvesting. And yet, the Democratic proponents of these bills, they don't address that. They don't dispute it. They don't have any facts to say to the contrary. Secretary Buchanan, what is your judgment as someone charged with administering elections as to the risks that ballot harvesting poses?
Thank you for the question, Senator Cruz. Ballot harvesting, especially in this bill, the only limit on it was that you couldn't be compensated, I believe, proportionally to the number of ballots you collected. And The simplest example that I can think of is you have someone who is perhaps trusted to collect ballots, but let's think about it from the perspective of not collecting ballots from people that may share your political beliefs, but you have bad actors out there who collect ballots from those who they disagree, but the people who cast those ballots don't know this. So what's to prevent somebody who harvests these ballots from simply throwing them away and not taking them to where they are supposed to go? And
we're certainly throwing them away on a partisan basis. So if people vote in a way that is inconsistent with the operative's partisan leaning, earlier Chairman Blumenthal suggested that I somehow believed the Republicans would not do well with increased Native American turnout. I don't believe that at all. I think Republicans can and have competed very effectively for the Native American vote and for votes across this country. What I believe is different, which is that voter fraud, although it occurs in both parties, and there have been people convicted of voter fraud to benefit both parties, voter fraud systemically benefits Democrats. And what is striking is, whether I believe that or not, Senate Democrats believe that, because every proposal they're advancing are proposals that would expand voter fraud. Ms. Frankenstein, let me ask a final question. One of the provisions of this bill grants tribes the authority to reject and remove poll watchers who aren't affiliated with the state. And that's a fairly remarkable provision. When people tell you they don't want outside observers even seeing what happens in an election, you should question what's going on. Is there any legitimate justification for giving the ability to throw election observers out and prevent even the mildest form of scrutiny as to the integrity of the election? And what are the risks of the integrity of the election of being able to throw observers out? And please turn your microphone on.
Thank you. I see no advantage to allowing such practices. In my state and in others with Indian tribes, we already have difficulty enforcing state election integrity laws on the reservation. There's an issue with who has jurisdiction on the reservation to enforce state laws. This compounds that problem. If we allow tribal law enforcement to determine basically who is eligible and who is not, by virtue of having the power of who gets to stay in the polling place and observe, we've got a recipe for the tribes taking over who's eligible to vote rather than our elected and trained election administrators and our legislators of the state who enact those voting laws.
And if I can,
I'm going to go on to
Sure.
Senator Ossoff because